a long, long time ago together. I'm a
Where?
school psychologist.
Okay.
This is our second year of implementation of Tier 2 in our building. And last year we rolled out to half the population, and this year we have gone to full school implementation.
Okay. And is there something specific that you want to get from the time with us today?
There really isn't. Um, we are really just trying to build our capacity to handle. We have about 1,000 students here at Badger,
Okay.
and we're just working hard to make sure that that happens.
And is that an elementary or middle?
It's a middle school,
Okay.
seventh
Good.
and eighth grade only.
Okay.
So we are, feeling pretty positive about what we have going, but we are far from at the point of fidelity.
Okay.
We feel like we just feel proud that we've gotten things off the ground.
Can be
Thank you.
quite a challenge. Thank you. Laurie, do you want to, well, you guys know each other. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit more? Or are you guys good and
I think, I think I'm good. I actually think West Bend, I may have trained them.
You did, yep. We missed one of the sessions that you did because we had a
Okay.
conference with our school days off, but Kent, you were the presenter at CISA 6 when we went to the last of the 4 training sessions 2 years ago.
Okay.
And Laurie was the presenter at CISA 1 for the first 3.
Okay.
Okay. It's kind of coming back to me. 2 years is a
Yeah,
lot.
and in fact, Kent, you were the one that really talked to us about how do you roll it out to 1,000 students. And your judgment was very beneficial because
Good.
we felt good going with a roll-in process rather than taking on the entire building. I think that helped us really develop our capacity.
Good. Good. Well, since we all know each other, don't need to do any more intros. Thanks for sharing. Here is, Cathy, for your information, our contact info. You probably already have Laurie's. I'm not sure if I gave mine, so it's there if you need to get a hold of us after this.
Okay.
And like I said, this is really going to be informal. What we wanted to do, though, throughout this series is just really review key elements. When you go through training, you get a lot of technical information. How do we do this? How do we do that? The idea behind these is to touch on that a little bit, but really spend more time focusing on adaptive things. The purpose behind things. How does it change our thinking? How does it change, our building's culture? Or how does our building culture and climate need to change to support, those kinds of things?
Mm-hmm.
And well, sometimes helping schools connect with other implementing schools in the region. In this case, you get to connect with us. Yay, lucky you! And really what today was built on was reviewing kind of that key information for 2 specific things: social academic instruction group and individualized check-in, check-out. And looks like we got somebody else coming on, which is great. So that's kind of what we're going to cover. And it really is
We get to the meeting this morning. Were you there?
intended on to be kind of more of a conversation, present a little bit of what we got, and then, ask any questions or clarify and help move beyond. So that's what we got. So with that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. Do you want to let Stacy just give her a minute to introduce herself?
Sure.
As long as there's only a few here.
Yeah, I am very sorry.
No, it's fine.
I'm Stacy Knight. I'm from the Nequan Thiensville School District. I'm a social worker within the district, and I also have a vice principal from our Wilson Elementary building.
Hi, I'm Missy Brainy.
Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
We just got started. So, and with us is Cathy from Badger Middle School in West Bend.
Okay.
And my name, for those of you that don't know me, is Kent Smith. I am a Regional Technical Assistance Coordinator for the RTI Center. I support and train schools primarily in CSIS 4, 10, and 11, but I'm also a part of the state's Culturally Responsive Practices Work Group and trainer for that as well. So, hi.
And I'm Laurie Cameron. I'm Laurie Cameron, and I work with CISA 1.
And I apologize for the phone in the background. There's another home office here, so apologies. What we had done was just really kind of review the emphasis of the sessions, and that's mainly to review key elements for the Tier 2 supports that schools can put into place, kind of moving a little bit beyond what you get in training, which is pretty technical, to really looking at some of those adaptive pieces. The purpose behind things, trying to get some clarification about why things may be structured the way they are, or how a school's climate or system changes through the implementation process. So really kind of looking at those more kind of heads and hearts pieces rather than just the technical aspects. And of course, to get schools to connect with each other that are implementing, to be able to kind of support each other as well. And right before you came on, we had kind of identified the two things we're talking about today. And those are really the interventions for skill deficits, so social academic instruction group or something along those lines, and for students that may have performance concerns, things like individualized check and check out. So what we're going to do is spend a little bit of time unpacking both of those, and then really kind of hoping to save a bit of time at the end for conversation, discussion, questions, comments, or scathing rebuttal for Laurie. Well, for both of us. So
And if you please feel free, you may want to mute your mic in case there is background noise, but please feel free to interrupt Kent at any time. I do all the time.
we're very formal around here. And here is our contact information if you do wish to get a hold of either of us afterwards. And I've got my Twitter information here. Most of the stuff that I do there is around culturally responsive practices and equity. I don't do as much around kind of the PBIS framework as much as I do equity within that, just as a aside. So with that, what we wanted to do is kind of spend a minute reviewing the intervention structures at Tier 2. And in the first couple sessions of this, we had talked about really building our system and what were the points behind the system conversation and the problem-solving conversation. And last time we identified data and progress monitoring as it relates to sort of your primary gateway intervention, which for a lot of our schools is check in, check out. But what we wanted to think about was really kind of moving beyond that. So if your primary intervention, which is, like I said, in most cases, check in, check out, if that's not successful for a student, really kind of what are our next steps? What are our next layers in supporting that student? And the key, I think, to understanding some of those adaptive things is not that Tier 2 supports are a linear progression, right? It's not that it's first check in, check out, and then social academic instruction group, and then mentoring, and then individualized check out. But really, if that gateway intervention isn't working, as a team identifying kind of how do we differentiate what comes next. And we want to be thinking about additional supports really from a standpoint of skill deficit, performance deficit, or engagement and motivation. So like I said, for today, we're going to focus on social academic instruction group and individualized check-in, check-out. So really looking at skill deficit-based intervention and sort of those performance things where we know the student has the skills but doesn't necessarily always consistently demonstrate them. So with that, first thing we want to look at is social academic instruction group. And historically, and Laurie can certainly probably confirm this based on her experiences in her region as well. This is probably one of the hardest things for schools to wrap their head around when they're building their Tier 2 infrastructure. Because SAIG, or those social academic instruction groups, tend to have a lot in common with what old practice had looked like. You know, either going to see the social worker, going to see the counselor, and we're going to do groups, and we talked about them the same way, right? They were skills groups. But it made it hard to kind of deconstruct what schools were historically doing. So what we wanted to do was kind of spend a little bit of time kind of separating out what it is, what it isn't, and why there's some difficulties at times with this. When we talk about SAIG, and we talk about sort of our progress monitoring rules, especially when we talk about that time frame, right? Are we seeing the intervention work over a period of time? As it relates to SAIG, the intervention time period is not about the duration of the instruction, right? It's not that we're necessarily going to spend 6 weeks providing instruction 20 minutes a day, 3 days a week for that 6-week period of time. A school may choose to do that based on their own sort of local considerations. But when we're looking at this in really sort of pure faith, big picture, the intervention time period refers to the amount of time that the student is sort of acquiring and learning to demonstrate and generalize that skill. So we're not necessarily saying that the instruction is going to be that 3 days a week, 20 minutes a day for 6 weeks. But over the course of the 6 weeks that the student may be in that intervention in SAIG, what we're interested in seeing in that 6 weeks is whether or not the instruction, right, however a school is structuring that, is having the desired effect. If we're seeing the student generalize that skill based on the instruction. One of the places that schools historically have struggled is around the intensity of the instruction. Because from a system standpoint, we want to be able to say that instruction for SAIG is going to be X, right? That it might be 3 days a week for 30 minutes or whatever. But in truth, what we're looking at is really the intensity of the instruction matching the frequency and the intensity of the behavior. There are going to be some skills that are based on your universal that are going to be really easy to essentially build your SAIG for that behavior around, right? If it's transitioning out to recess, or if it's transitioning in the hallway to middle school or a high school, and for some reason the student's not been able to get it with reteaching, for something like that, we're going to go back to the matrix, see how it was taught, and then really think about differentiating the instruction. Do we need to provide additional examples? Do we need to provide additional practice? Kind of what is it that we need to do different to reteach that and see if that reteaching translates into a change in student behavior, right? Are they learning, acquiring, generalizing the skill? The emphasis in the intervention is on skill acquisition and, more importantly, moving the student to self-monitoring of their performance. So when we've had students that have responded to the intervention and that are doing really, really well, there's sort of a tendency to say, hey, this is working, let's keep the student in it. What we want to do is move the student from relying on the environment and the staff around them for that behavioral feedback to getting them where they can read the environmental cues the same as everybody else and can sort of monitor and modify their own behavior. So we want to fade the support. We want to fade the reliance on the adults within the system and get that student to the point where they're able to self-monitor, read the cues like everybody else, and change their behavior accordingly. So at the end of your intervention period, for that student, or for all of the students receiving the intervention, if we're seeing success, we really want to be thinking about how is that student fading? How are they relying less and less on the environment and the adults in the environment and building their ability to self-monitor? The role of the intervention delivery is kind of shifting to the system itself, which is another place where schools get hung up. In other words, what historically has happened is we have said that doing groups are going to be the purview of the counselor or the social worker, or in some cases the psychologist, or, and really assigning that intervention and that responsibility to a role. As we're building SAIG, we're wanting to see that delivery, that instruction, and that feedback shift to the system. So a lot of times what schools will say is something like, well, it's really going to be hard for the classroom teacher to provide that instruction. So in our building, we're choosing for the counselor to do it. Okay, so here's what you want to think about if you cannot kind of provide that instruction in the natural setting by the person responsible for the setting, which is what's ideal, right? What we want to do is try to get as close to that as possible. We want SAIG instruction to happen in the environment we're going to see the behavior occur in, because that way the environmental cues are there, the student is learning how to read those cues, they're learning how the feedback looks in that setting, they're able to see other students, other examples demonstrating that behavior in the setting. And ideally, by having the person responsible for that setting teach it, then they're learning from the beginning what that feedback looks like. Again, if we can't do that for whatever reason, you want to try to figure out how to get as close to that as possible. So if you can do the instruction in the setting, but not necessarily have the person responsible for the setting deliver it, cool. Then what you can do is do the instruction in the setting, and maybe the counselor is the one that's delivering it, but the counselor is going to be talking to the person responsible for the setting about really how would they typically give feedback? What would the desired behavior look like? How can we help the student know that they're acquiring the skill? So that the person that's teaching it is going to be able to come as close as possible to creating the environment that the student's going to expect. So we're really wanting to think about how the intervention looks in the setting, and how do we all own the intervention, because we're all going to be providing feedback, we're all going to be providing support, we're all going to be providing those cues to the student. My background prior to coming to the RTI Center was a school social worker in Eau Claire. And early on in my career, I was responsible for doing a lot of that social skills instruction, right, for the student that wasn't quite getting it. So, the students would come to my office and we would do the group and we would release the student back to their classroom or back to the playground or whatever. And what happens in that is, while it's easy to do the instruction, when we set it up that way, we're asking the student to hold in their memory not only the instruction, but how we explained the behavior would look like in the setting, hold that in their memory, transition back, go back into the setting we're expecting the behavior to occur in, and then hopefully that teaching stuck throughout all of those multiple transitions. So I affectionately refer to this as the catch and release model of social skills instruction, right? We're going to lift them out of their environment, we're going to provide instruction, we're going to turn them loose. What we want to do is really move to the person and environment. How does it look in that setting? How do we give the feedback in the setting in a way that's logical, natural, and helps with that skill acquisition? And the last thing that we want to kind of think about in terms of anticipatory guidance, or kind of where schools sometimes struggle with this, is increasing the need for professional development around the purpose of the intervention. So if you think about kind of how social skills historically has been done, if Timmy was struggling with something, we would sign the kid up to meet with the social worker, the counselor, and they would go to their curriculum and pick it, and we would try to find a couple other kids with similar concern, we'd get consent, we'd run the intervention. But what would happen is the emphasis was on the group itself. And what we want to make sure people understand through SAIG, or anytime we do these skills-based instructions, is that it's not about the instruction. The instruction is critical, but the intervention is really more about moving that student from the skill acquisition to mastery and generalization. and how do we get our staff to understand that, right? Because that's a huge, it's a really huge difference in how we've thought in the past and how we've operated in the past. So these are the places that schools typically historically have struggled with. Laurie, does that kind of line up with what you've seen?
Yeah. And I have to be honest, I even struggled with what it would look like until began seeing schools that had figured it out. And I'll just give you an example. There's a elementary school, I'm not even sure where their school is in the state, but they had a SAIG group for any student that received an office discipline referral on the playground. They would report to the SAIG group, which happened during recess, was conducted by the playground supervisor for the duration of a week. And they had a special check-in, check-out form, and there is one from Leanne Hawkins' book specifically for non-academic settings that they used to monitor to see, if it took, and the recidivism was really very low. Hardly any kids after spending a week with a playground supervisor with guided social academic instructional, lessons around what playground behavior was, that took care of the behavior problems on the playground. And I know the first time I heard that, I thought, well, a week instructional time, that you can't do that, but because it generally takes 3 weeks for a behavior to become a habit. But they were monitoring it for longer than that.
Yep.
And so that is exactly, it was efficient and it was effective.
And I think what you just said with the monitoring is important to kind of mention too. So understanding that monitoring is not sort of this passive thing that we used to do, right? That monitoring is really capturing that information and providing that feedback and helping the student understand that, yeah, kind of what I just did is what they're looking for. It's the desired behavior and kind of getting that cue from the environment. So it becomes a very active systemic process, right? Is what you're saying, Laurie?
Sorry, I'm muting myself. Yeah, and I know you're probably going to talk about the adaptive change that requires, and it happens in a couple different areas. But I also want to just kind of underpin that this is meant to be an efficiency model.
Yep.
And if you have one particular staff member who pulls kids out, and then that catch and release that Kent was talking about, it isn't, while it may seem like it's efficient, I don't think it really is, because you have all these other things that you have to do to try to transfer that skill into the setting in which it has to happen. So I think what we're looking at is how can we have the instruction, and most of the skills happen in the classroom. That's just the way that is. How can we figure out a way to have the skill instruction happen in the setting in which it takes place, knowing how full a teacher's job is already.
Yep.
How can we do that efficiently and effectively?
Yep. So when we think about social academic instruction group, and this slide identifies it as basic SAIG, but I think here's what you want to think about. SAIG, or kind of what we do if check and check out doesn't work by itself, is really intended to provide that sort of reteaching that's linked to your universal, as opposed to social skills instruction that may be linked to things beyond your basic matrix, right? So basic SAIG or SAIG is really intended to align really, really perfectly with your matrix, with your universal system. What was taught, how was it taught, and then how do we essentially kind of differentiate because that first teaching didn't work. there is going to be a place for more intense social skills instruction. And that's going to come, as part of the FBA BIP process. Because what you want to do, like Laurie just said, is really look at this from an efficiency standpoint. The majority of students are going to benefit from essentially that reteaching of Tier 1. Different examples, different activities, kind of doing it in a small group, those kinds of things. The majority of students aren't going to need intense social skills instruction like anger management, friendship skills, things like that. We're going to reserve those for the students that have demonstrated the need for that. And we're going to talk about, when we get to that point in our Tier 2 series, FBA BIP, what do we need to make those old behaviors unnecessary, inefficient, and ineffective? And that's where that more intense instruction would come into play. For basic SAIG, again, what you want to be thinking about is how does this go back to the universal? So like Laurie said, safety on the playground. So the school that she's talking about would have had on their matrix responsible, respectful, safe, and what it looks like on the playground, or maybe what it looks like using certain pieces of equipment. SAIG is going to go back to that, right? So when we think about SAIG, the goal for any student that's in that intervention should be common across the students in the intervention, right? So in other words, what we're going to think about is, do we have a large number of students that need safety on the playground? Then we're going to create sort of that sort of language, the lesson plans, sort of the infrastructure to deliver that. Do we have a number of students who may need transition in the hallway? So the goal for improvement's got to be common across the students that are receiving it, right? Specifically that there is a skill deficit in a particular area around a particular expectation. What you want to be careful of, though, is that we don't create an infrastructure that requires us to only start SAIG when we have a number of students ready to go. So old way of thinking would be, we're going to identify 6 students that need this, and then we're going to do it. Because the question that you've got to think about is, in that old way of doing it, so the kid that really, really needs that, we're not starting the intervention for until we have 5 or 6 other kids with a similar need. Within SAIG, we want the student to be able to receive that instruction really essentially as soon as they become eligible, right? So we're not going to wait to start that instruction and that intervention until we've got a number. We're going to wait for the kid to be ready, identified, and we're going to be able to go.
So can I jump in here for a second? One of the things that this also brings up, and I'm going back to when Ken said that, traditionally we think of kids that need maybe anger management. And one of the adaptive changes here is to re-gear who we think should be receiving Tier 2 services.
Yeah.
To students that just need a little bit more support, and maybe they're not really showing up on office discipline referrals, but they are showing up in minors, and they are annoying the teacher. So that's one of the reasons why it's important when you begin doing Tier 2 to have that minor system, because it is more sensitive to the students that we are really looking at. And then the other thing that I do want to say is, one of the things that helps with the effectiveness of this is if you identify, say, a kid that they have a hard time with transitions. They have a hard time organizing their stuff, moving from one thing to the other. They just have a hard time with that. My guess is, even though there's one kid that was referred to that, there might be other kids that would benefit from it. And I'll give you an example. Kindergarten. I was doing a training, and it seemed like all the kids that they were targeting for check-in, check-out were kids that had a hard time when a teacher said no to them. And, it's like, okay, so good. You have some kids and you're working with them on check and check out. At some point in time, it would really be a good thing to maybe teach this smaller group some of the, how you handle when a teacher says no. And not only that, wouldn't it be nice to emphasize that with all the students? So all the students get the basic lesson, and then you move back a little bit and you give a little bit more opportunity for practice to the few students that are really having a hard time, and then it isn't isolating the instruction so much. So I'm kind of interested to get your feedback, because we've just been talking a lot, and I know we have questions in the back, but Kent, do you mind if I'm just curious what's going on in people's heads and what they're processing of what we're seeing.
Sure.
Can we kind of hear from you, and how does this connect with your experience? You're probably going to have to unmute yourselves.
Actually, I can.
Cathy, can I go to you first? Can I ask you to unmute?
It's unmuted.
Okay. Yeah, but it's showing up as, I think she has herself muted. Oh, Stacy, you're unmuted. Do you want to start?
I'm actually thinking, honestly, I'm thinking about going back to the tier 1 level at this point, and because we keep talking about lesson plans and going the teachings, and I feel like, yep, we need to do that within these instruction groups, but for us, we almost need to go back to the universal level with those teachings.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And that, I just want to say that is what happens as you begin to implement Tier 2, is very naturally what happens is it shows up where there are weak links in Tier 1. Because it's now you understand what Tier 1 is meant to hold up and support.
I think
That's a really good observation.
Yeah, and I mean, and we've done obviously those lessons in the universal level. However, I think we need to go back and review those more often than what we're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Part of how I typically talk about this and train this is that, schools have been implementing Tier 1 for a period of time, and they built this really, really cool house, and they've got all these things that have worked really well, but they kind of forget to do maintenance. So, it's good to go back and paint it, maybe touch up the trim, do a little bit of preventive maintenance, and that's essentially it, right? The idea behind Tier 2 is that it's layered on a strong, solid, robust Tier 1. So if you're hearing things like, yeah, we got to do some fluency checks at Tier 1, you're right. If you got any question, go to it, do it, because that's going to make the Tier 2 pieces stronger when you get there.
And that is one of the reasons that we ask that you have someone from Tier 1 team on your Tier 2 team, because that's part of the back and forth communication.
Thanks for sharing that, Stacey.
Thank you.
Cathy? And I know that she said that she might be pulled away because she was on real school time.
And you're right, Laurie, she did mute herself on her end. It's not her. Oh, she's unmuted.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I did have a student in here. I apologize.
I figured.
When you're building for a training, you're guaranteed not to have too many interruptions, but when you're here, they find you. Okay, what was the question? I apologize.
Well, I know, and you were talking with a student, but we were wondering just to, how you're processing this, how it connects to, we were saying the whole thing about, number one, teaching the lessons in the setting in which they're at, which is usually the classroom. Really kind of rethinking about who it is that you are identifying in need of SAIG, so that it's a little bit more kids that are less intense, not just your anger management kids.
Yes. So you're asking what kinds of SAIG things we're doing?
Well, I'm curious as to how this connects. Like, you're middle school, so how do you see this playing out at middle school?
I mean, honestly, we are not seeing kids unless they hit one of our bigger data points than you're talking about. So we're expecting that things are being retaught for our tier one, but they're not really reaching us until they're referred to the office or their attendance becomes problematic or, they're referred for some other reason. So we often don't see these sort of the problems at the minor level.
Yeah,
Basically from a logistics standpoint, and we talked about the fact that we
yeah.
have about 1,000 students and not the capacity to handle the smaller problems.
Yes, that's really a capacity conversation. And it's going to end up looking much, much different. And um, I would say organizationally, so that some of those things can be handled in a classroom. And you may not be at that point yet.
We are a middle school model, so we have house teachers that meet together and problem solve and do intervention support at the house level.
Yes.
So that's kind of before they get to us. In most cases, not all. I mean, sometimes kids clearly rise to the point where they need supports right at the beginning of the school year. But
So here's one thing I'm going to throw out. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But I'm just throwing it out, and I'm kind of curious what Kent would say too. Is I have always thought I really like that house concept. And one of the things it does afford you is you're saying that teachers are taking care of it within the structure of the house. And we are a database decision-making, database, data-driven
yes.
framework. So the one thing that's there for me is how do you know that what the house is doing is working other than it's being more subjective? Is there a way that easily, if you can see that the house is identifying a group of students that say, hey, this group of students, we know they need to get more support in their study skills. And how do you know that whatever you do to support those students is actually working? Is there a way you can somehow have the Tier 2 team help monitor those efforts in an easy way?
Oh, good question. Well, we use a PDSA cycle. Are you familiar with that Plan, Do, Study, Act process?
Yes.
And so we, ironically, just this morning started talking about implementing that at the house level for, the kids that we're struggling with that the simple interventions have not been effective to resolve their issues.
Mm-hmm.
That's really the only level right now that we would be monitoring progress with intervention supports.
Okay.
One thing that you can do too, and I'm not weighing in to say you're doing it wrong or anything like that by any stretch. What I've seen some of the middle schools that I support do is with the house structure, really create mini tier 2 systems at the house level, but then thinking of those as like subcommittees of the bigger tier 2. So what Laurie's kind of talking about, I think, is, if you have house A, right, that all of the students that are part of that house essentially become a mini school, right? And you set data rules that say when, the teacher has had to stop and reteach 4 or 5 times for a certain behavior, then the house is going to have its own check and check out system catchment area, right? So the students start check and check out, and then it goes across wherever the student goes, right? Because we all know how to deliver check and check out.
Yes.
When check in, check out's not working for that particular student, the house is then going to move into that skill intervention. If it's a skill-based issue, or move into the engagement or motivation issues. So they become the catchment point for all the students within that house, but the intervention is delivered across the school setting wherever the student goes, right? Because we've trained everybody to do it the same way. That common language, the common intervention, that kind of thing. So it makes it easier to track. Everybody has data rules, but rather than having a team try to keep an eye on 1,000,
Right.
you have 4 different teams trying to keep an eye on 250, and then feed it up to the bigger picture.
Interesting idea.
Of course, your mileage may vary, but it's kind of essentially the same thing, right? You're creating subcommittees to make accountability a little bit easier, or fidelity a little bit easier.
Well, and we do have membership on some of those. We have 6 houses, and we have membership on some of those houses as a part of our Tier 2 team.
Mm-hmm.
That's a little bit easier than kind of pushing out to teams that have no support through our Tier 2 team. But that's an interesting way to conceptualize supporting those students at a micro level, I guess, instead of the macro level.
And it kind of addresses the capacity a little bit easier.
Right.
And different houses have different expertise, So each house will be wrapping themselves around the kids in maybe a slightly different way.
True.
But again, it's that contextual fit.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Bet.
So,
Sorry to interrupt. This is an example of how I interrupt Kent.
it's all good. I've learned to code switch. All right, bad joke. Sorry. So, when we talk about those basic features, again, of SAIG, we kind of talked about this earlier, that we want to make sure that the skills that are being taught in the environment they're going to be used, right? We're thinking about natural setting as much as possible. We don't want it to be based on where can the student go to have the instruction done by whom, right? As close to the natural setting, as close as possible to the people that are going to give the feedback around that behavior is ideal. The closer we can get to that, the stronger the intervention is going to be. Again, that's also pure faith, understanding that there are going to be contextual variables in that, right? So that big adaptive shift, that big adaptive thinking is understanding kind of what the ideal is, and then how can we, within our setting, get as close to that as we can in a way that works for us, right? Understanding, realizing that there is no perfect. The other thing that we want to make sure is kind of, Laurie alluded to this a little bit earlier, is that we're also wanting to make sure that stakeholders have input in the intervention, right? So the people that are going to be giving the student feedback need to know what successful demonstration of the behavior looks like, right? So they should be the one that's teaching it, right? That's that ideal piece. We want to make it effective. We want to make it efficient. So on the face of it, it may not seem necessarily efficient to have, the person that supervises the playground teach the lesson, or the person that supervises the study hall teach the lesson, or having individual classroom teachers teach a lesson in their classroom. But when you look at the efficiency of it, bigger picture, we're doing things the same way. We're able to measure things using the DPR, the Daily Progress Report, the same way. We have the common language, right? Because we're kind of doing things the same way. We're just doing it relative to our context, to that setting that we're responsible for. So again, that's kind of the ideal. And then families needing to understand how they support that intervention. So if it's SAIG, a family is going to essentially kind of do the same thing that we ask them to do with basic check-in, check-out, right? Help the student process what their day was like around that behavior. Pre-correct in the morning before the student goes to school, and kind of reinforce any reteaching that had to happen within the school setting. Right, so what you're going to start seeing with SAIG is a lot of those system pieces that we put into place with check-in, check-out being harnessed in a way for SAIG to make the intervention more effective. But this is why it's a little bit harder for schools, because we start thinking about old practice versus alignment and how do we harness what's in place. I'm actually going to skip this one. We talked a lot about this. We want to talk about progress monitoring for it. So again, when we assess the intervention, we're looking at two things. We're looking, first of all, at whether or not the student that's receiving that intervention is acquiring, transferring, and generalizing the skill that's being taught. That's the point of just the intervention. We're not looking at whether or not they can articulate it during instruction in the counselor's office. We're looking for whether or not we're seeing it in the setting, the way that it was taught or retaught. So are we seeing that instruction result in transference and generalization? We're going to use the daily progress report to assess that, right? To measure it, and I'll show you an example of it in just a second. So it's our way of capturing that student level data. Did we see the behavior in the setting we're looking for? The DPR also acts as a prompt, as a reminder for the student going into that setting that, oh, right, this is the behavior that I need to be showing. This is what they're going to be looking for. The DPR serves as reinforcement of that replacement behavior. So again, going back on our early Tier 2 conversations and even on our Tier 1 conversations, minor reteaching and even the DPR are not intended as punitive tools, right? It's intended as a way of documenting, at least a minor, that an in-the-moment reteaching happened, right? Students running down the hall, we stop them, we ask them to articulate what, safe behavior in the hallway looks like, to show us, and we acknowledge it. The DPR is meant to measure fluency, essentially. Are we seeing the desired behaviors demonstrated in the settings? That's different than a minor or different than an ODR. That's really a measure of error and the need for reteaching. And then the DPR is used as a communication and a feedback and a buy-in tool for stakeholders, right? Because the staff, the teachers, whoever is using the DPR with the student is able to provide the student with immediate feedback. And it's a way for information to go to the Tier 2 system saying, essentially, yes, we're seeing the intervention work, or no, it's not. And we're starting to honor the staff voice as well. So
can I just step in here for a sec? So one thing I just want to check is the listening what you think of when you hear Kent say daily progress report, because the form looks like the form used for check and check out, and that's accurate and it's designed that way. And it may or may not be done through the check and check out, which includes a greeter. Especially at middle school and even in elementary school, you have some kids that have skill deficits or practice deficits that just don't buy in to the check in, check out. But what Kent is saying is you use on the teacher's end, they use this in the same way. They are still recording it. It just doesn't go necessarily to the student. The card may not go to the student, but the reinforcement would definitely happen periodically by the teacher. It's still used as a tool to support the teacher in increasing the ratio of positives to correctives around the skills that are listed, like be on time for class and have material out and ready when the bell rings. So I just want to make sure that when he's saying daily progress report, you're not hearing check in, check out. Check in, check out can be used as a daily progress report, but you can use the daily progress report without the check in, check out intervention. So is that clear? If you can raise your hand or not, or just unmute and say, yeah, I got it.
Got it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's always a good reminder to put in front of people, Laurie, that the DPR is not the intervention. The DPR is the way of measuring an intervention. The intervention is the relationship. It's what's happening between the student and the staff and the environment. The DPR is only the way of measuring that thing, right? So when we talk about SAIG, like Laurie said, on the DPR, on the measurement tool, it provides that reminder for the student and the staff members that are saying, essentially, the prompt that we put under be responsible here, like be on time for class, have material ready. This is what we taught, right? This was the instructional part of SAIG, and this is how we're measuring that generalization and transfer. Are we seeing the student doing this the way that we taught it when we went back to reteach it as a part of that SAIG? This looks a lot different than, it looks the same with a different purpose than individualized check and check out. With individualized check and check out, a school may put a reminder for the student, but with SAIG, this is what we have actively taught. This is what we are actively measuring. Is the student doing this particular behavior, being on time for class and having material out the way that we taught it? So the form, the DPR may look like what we see with individualized check and check out, but it's a totally different creature because this is what the basis of SAIG is. Okay, which brings us to individualized check and check out, and we have just a couple minutes left, so I want to hit this really quickly and turn you loose for questions, comments, and scathing rebuttal. The big thing with individualized check and check out is that what we are targeting with individualized check and check out are performance issues. So we're thinking about what is preventing the student from consistently demonstrating the behavior we know they can do. This may be something like changing the check-in location and time, right? So for the student who we're not getting information from, we're not getting daily progress report scores from, making a modification, a simple modification like that, so they're checking in with their greeter, things like that. Adding goals to the DPR, or adding prompts to the DPR. Modifying the goal. So a goal modification would be something like a student who has been in check and check out and is just pretty consistently falling short of meeting goal. So the goal is 80%, and this student's been sitting there at like 72% for a couple of weeks, just can't quite make it. We may short-term lower the goal to something that's attainable for the student so they can meet it, they can feel that success, and then we move it back up. So what we're thinking about with individualized check and check out, big picture, are essentially generic and pre-selected or pre-designed system modifications that are really targeted toward enhancing student performance, providing reminders, addressing any kind of system barriers that the student may be experiencing to keep them from consistently showing it. What we want to do is make sure that we have a limited number of these pre-identified, so students that show up with having a performance issue, we can say, all right, based on our menu of these 5 things, this is going to be that modification that'll work, that individualization. The big takeaway for this is that not every student is going to need individualized check and check out. So there's some districts that I've worked with that immediately jump to individualized check and check out because they want every single student to have a goal. So they put goals on every single DPR. Again, remember, our basic check and check out or our gateway intervention should work for close to 70% of the students in it. It's those remainder of students that we're going to differentiate for, which means, theoretically, only about 10% of students might need individualized check and check out. 10% of the remainder, I'm sorry. So thinking about individualized check and check out, we reserve it. We predetermine a limited number of relatively generic modifications we can apply, and the intent is to help elicit the student demonstrating the skill that they've got. It's not focused on instruction, it's focused on performance. So that brings us to the end of this. And what we want to do is kind of give you a chance for any questions or comments. If anything comes up between now and the next time that we have one of these, which is in about 6 weeks, please get a hold of either Laurie or myself or your regional TAC, and they can help kind of talk through this. And then a friendly reminder to make sure you have scheduled any system assessments you need to do in the spring or any that you have not done yet this fall. So with that, Laurie, any last minute thoughts before we turn it over to them?
Yeah, the stuff is in the FIAD office.
I want to just see what questions they have. I think we've talked a lot, so.
What y'all got?
I don't have any questions at the moment, and I'm sorry I have a meeting at 1 that I have to run to, so I'm going to run away right now. I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good break.
We also don't have any questions. However, I was just wondering, are the PowerPoints available after the
I can send you the PowerPoints. These have also all been recorded. They've not been posted yet because I've been waiting for our communication people to tell me where to send them. But the PowerPoint and the videos will be available there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks for your participation.
Oh, thank you. We greatly appreciate the information.
Thanks for your time. Have a good break.
Yep, you too.
Bye.